Okay, so you've set up your project and changed a preference, but there's still a few things that you need to set up before getting going in Cubase. Now, I am heading into the studio menu here, and this is important for you to understand. Different DAWs approach patching and routing and interfacing with audio hardware differently. If you're quite used to Pro Tools, you'll know that you get kind of a grid view of inputs and outputs in terms of how to patch that. If you're used to Reaper, you know that you kind of have all your inputs and outputs available in drop-down menus, and there's a lot of routing flexibility in terms of sends and returns and auxes and things like that. The Steinberg way of doing this is to set up just what you need. So you can also combine multiple devices. It's very flexible, but by default, you don't have this big grid or drop-down menu with all your different inputs and outputs available. So I'm specifically talking about audio hardware now. If you've got an audio interface plugged into your system and routing where what goes. If you're just mixing, then all you really care about is your output, where you monitor to your headphones or your studio monitors. So I'm going to go to Studio Setup. And again, this is preferences unique to this particular system. It's not general software preferences. This is your studio, how things work. You'll notice here it's defaulted to my VST audio system. VST is a technology that Steinberg developed, and you'll see it applies to certain plugins or instruments, and that's also what they call the audio system here. When I'm going to go out again, this used to be called VST connections and VST lots of different things, but they've simplified some of the menus. So just going back into Studio Setup, I am going to ignore most of this today, and I'm going to focus on video and your VST audio system. So that is your sound card that you choose. Now, if you're in the top VST audio system menu, you can see what your system latency is, which you'll see will change. I am currently using my Focusrite Sapphire, and my input latency is 8 milliseconds. If I change that to built-in audio, I'm switching. Unlike Pro Tools, it's very good at switching, hot switching while you're in a project without having to restart that project. You can see my latency is up to 12 or almost 13 milliseconds. So I'm going to keep this on Sapphire, my audio interface. You don't have to set anything else here. ASIO Guard is something you might get into on some machines, but not getting into that now. But this is the high-level VST audio system settings. And once you've chosen the sound card or the driver that you want, you might have more than one driver. Especially if you're on a PC, you might install ASIO for all for your sound card, built-in one, and then you choose that here. Once you've chosen that, you can go choose that driver one level down here. Now that gives you a lot of details in terms of all the inputs and outputs you have. You can see I have a lot of inputs and outputs on this, 56 in total. I can hide them if I don't want to see them. And you can see the names that you get from the sound card there. And this is also where you set your clock source. If you have fancy systems that are multiple devices that are clocked together, you can choose different word clock or clock sources here, internal for most of what you're going to do. And this menu also lets you open the control panel linked to your sound card. Now this differs depending on which sound card you have. If you in our sound studio and you've got the metric halo, this is going to open a slightly different menu. If I open it here, all it gives me is my buffer size and an option that might be quite important. Buffer size, in a nutshell, without getting into too much detail, a lower buffer size means that you have less latency. So if you're busy doing live recordings, not live recordings where you're listening to either your own signal coming back from the computer or multi-tracking other recording files that have already been recorded, a lower latency latency caused by lower buffer size is useful because then the two aren't too far apart. A high latency makes it very difficult to perform while listening to the sounds you're getting from the computer. So if you need to record and have low latency, then a lower value here helps. But if you go too low for what your computer is capable of, you might start getting clicks or pops or audio dropouts. What we're going to be doing here is mixing and post-production, where there won't really be live tracking. So there's no need to have a very, very short latency time. So I would recommend setting a higher buffer size, which not only means your computer doesn't have to work as hard, but specifically in Cubase and Nuendo, it also means that certain things happen faster. Things like audio exports, when you do a non-real time, like a quick export, and loudness checks and stuff like that, they actually happen faster if you have a higher buffer. So something like 512 should work for a lot of cases, but I'm going to go up as high as 1024, even though I've got a fairly strong machine here, because that will suit what we need to do here today. So you can see my latency has gone up a lot, but that doesn't really matter for what we need to do. Now, the other thing on the control panel here, this set device attenuation to 0 decibels. So for devices like this Sapphire Liquid 56 and other similar Focusrites, you do need to set device attenuation to 0. Same thing for your built-in audio, but it's specifically if you're in our sound classroom, Michelle, when you use that Apogee ensemble, or you don't want this enabled. Otherwise, it's going to max out your volume. And that is when you've got hardware devices that kind of plug in on the system level on a Mac, when you can actually use that keyboard shortcut to set the level on the audio interface, then you probably don't want this one enabled. Just to give you an idea, this is the one I'm using right now, and you can see my output monitor level is set there. That is where I set my calibrated levels, and Cubase doesn't make it even less because it sends the full signal through. So that's that. I want you to see what it looks like when I change over to my built-in audio. I'm going to switch and then go to the control panel. You will notice a few extra settings here from kind of our built-in settings that you can configure. And again, you can set the buffer size, and obviously many fewer inputs and outputs compared to what we have. We will come back to this in terms of a simple setup like in the classroom. So let me set it to Sapphire again. And you'll see I've got a few options on that list. It depends on software, emulation, and other sound cards. You can have multiple sound cards plugged in, and they will all show up on that list. So I've got that. In terms of video, there's actually not much to set here. If you're Nuendo, you have a few more video options.